Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about the consumption of sugar in our diet. How much is too much? And what are the consequences of too much sugar consumption? My guest today is Dr. Virginia Gray. Dr. Gray is an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences. Welcome, Virginia, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Well, when we talk about sugar, we're really going to focus on added sugar because that's the area of concern that people have is the so-called added sugars. That would include table sugar, that would include any sugar that's added to soda and soft drinks, and it would also include sugars that are added to baked goods and processed goods that we consume regularly. So we should also say that sugar is a natural product. It exists in many of the foods that we eat. Certainly fruit is sweet because of fructose, which is a simple sugar. Milk has sugar in it. And even our starch carbohydrates, such as whole grains and potatoes, have complex carbohydrates, which are basically sugars. So let's talk about first, before we get to the added sugar, the nutritional value of naturally grown or organically generated sugars in the diet. What's the nutritional benefit of that kind of sugar for us?
Sure. So we use two basic forms of energy for our bodies. We use glucose, and when you mention these types of sugars, every carbohydrate is broken down into glucose in the body. We also use fats. We also get some energy from protein, but we have to convert it to one of these sources to be able to use it. So our brain and our central nervous system prefer to run on glucose. That said, there's no requirement for carbohydrate in our diet, but the body of evidence related to carbohydrate consumption and chronic disease prevention shows us that foods that contain these natural sugars like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and dairy, these products are associated with a reduction in our chronic disease risk.
Well, let's talk about the fact that most of us, myself included, have a sweet tooth. We prefer sugar and we like sugar, and that's why added sugar has become such an issue, because if something has sugar in it, I'm all over it, as are many people. And so we should talk about why we do have a sweet tooth and what the evolutionary biological origins of that might be, and why we seem to have a genetic disposition to pursue sugar or sweet taste. I think that it's probably pretty clear that back in our hunter-gatherer phase of existence, we were pursuing sugars, fruits and vegetables and things of that nature because it tasted good, but it must have had some value to us. And also, biologists have found that in our taste buds, we have what are called receptors, and we have one basic receptor apparently for sweet taste, but 25 receptors to filter out the sour or bitter tastes. And some people say that we have the 25 receptors to filter sour and bitter because in the old days when we didn't know any better, we might be eating something that was rotten, that's why it was sour, or it might have been toxic, that's why it was bitter. But you have a slightly different take on that. What is your take on why we have so many bitter receptors and only one sweet receptor?
Right, so it doesn't take any work to like sugary foods, and as you mentioned, it's wired in our genes to prefer these foods that gave us plenty of energy. So as you mentioned, development of, throughout human history, it was adaptive for us to find foods that gave us plenty of energy and eat them, and then to avoid foods that had poisons in them. So poisonous foods tend to taste bitter. This is something really important for parents to think about when they're introducing new foods to children. If a new parent introduces a fruit to a child, for example, it's really easy for them to like that fruit. A banana, for example. They're going to like that sweet taste. However, when they introduce a vegetable, the initial response may not be as positive. And so it takes multiple exposures to learn to like those foods. So I think it's really important for parents to shift in their thinking about vegetables. And you can relate this to other things that parents work on with their kids. For example, if a parent wanted their child to become good at a sport or good at an instrument, they wouldn't take them one time and expect them to master it. And with vegetables, there really is that need for learning to like it. And with respect to those variety of bitter receptors that we have, if you learn to like broccoli, that doesn't mean necessarily you're going to now like beets, because there are different compounds and different flavors. So it really is a learning process. It doesn't take any work to learn to like sugar and fatty foods, but it takes work to learn to like the bitter foods.
So to summarize, I guess your take on this is that we have to help our children, we have to nurture them through the process of the bitter filtering so that they eventually develop a taste for the vegetables that may initially seem somewhat bitter.
That's true, and I remember with my own son, one night at dinner I served artichokes. This was 3 or 4 years ago, so he was 6 or 7, and he said to me, "Mom, you must have served this 10 times because I like it now." And so he apparently has heard me talk about that need to taste things over and over to learn to like it. And after 10 times in his book, he found artichokes to be a great food to eat.
Okay, well, let's move on to describing the various types of sugars that we encounter. And we do have a slide to help us here. So we'll go to the first slide. And we can see that we have glucose, which is that yellow, I guess, circular or some sort of geometric shape there on the left side at the top. That's glucose. In the middle, we see something that looks blue. That's fructose, which is what we get in fruit, simple sugar in fruit. And then at the bottom, we see galactose, that green element there, which is actually a naturally occurring simple sugar in milk. We move over to the right side of the screen, and we see that we have more complex sugars, the double sugars. And as we move along down the chain, we get to the carbohydrates. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the complex carbohydrates. Tell us what we're looking at there. A lot of chains, but also something very complicated there on the right side, which is glycogen. What's involved with this slide?
So we see the basic building block of carbohydrates is the single sugar. As you mentioned, the glucose, or the yellow that we saw on the previous screen, is a component of all these other types of complex carbohydrates that we see here. Starch is on the left. It's a chain of glucose units. And then we see fiber, which is chains of glucose units, but they're joined together in ways that our body can't break down. So it passes through our body and has certain health benefits associated with that. The one on the right is glycogen, and that's the way that we store carbohydrates in our muscles and our liver. This is important for us in times between meals, and you think about carbohydrate loading for athletes. This is what they're doing, is storing carbohydrate in this form.
Okay, well, let's talk about whole grains, because we've been told that we need to eat whole grains as opposed to just eating white bread or white bleached flour. So we actually do have a slide about whole grain as well that we're going to take a look at here. And what do we get from whole grain, and why should we eat that?
So this slide here shows us a kernel of wheat, which is in the whole grain form. Other whole grains, corn, for example, oats, also follow this similar pattern. And so what we see on the outside of this grain is the hull or the husk. That part's removed. If you ever are eating oatmeal and you find a piece that you don't think is very chewable, that's the husk that's been left in there. Then we also see in the middle the endosperm. This is the starchy part of the grain that we get when we eat white flour. So if you see a package of bread that says wheat bread, for example, it's coming from the wheat plant, but that doesn't mean that it's whole wheat. Then we see the bran layer on the outside of the endosperm, and then that yellow seed is the germ. And most of the nutrients, the vitamins, minerals, and the fibers are found in that bran and germ. So when we remove those pieces, then we're left without a lot of the fiber and the vitamins and minerals in the grain.
Okay, well, let's talk about added sugar, because so far we've been mostly talking about the naturally occurring or organic sugars that we encounter. What about the added sugar? Why are experts sounding the alarm about too much added sugar, and what are some of the health consequences if we have too much added sugar? And again, we're talking about adding sugar from table sugar or other ways of getting the sugar into our baked goods and our sodas and so forth.
Right, so organizations like the American Heart Association have been putting out guidelines for consumers as well as publications for professionals. And it's interesting to see an organization like the AHA that we've thought about related to fat and sodium now really emphasizing the importance of added sugar. And so there are 3 basic ways we can think about the health effects of added sugar that relate to our chronic disease risk, heart disease risk, as well as diabetes risk. So one is that when we consume diets high in added sugar, it tends to be associated with an increase in our calories. And there are a couple of ways that this might be happening. So one is that about half of the added sugars that we're consuming are coming in the forms of sugar-sweetened beverages. So when we're consuming those liquid calories, we don't compensate as much by eating less food. Also, there is a potential for these added sugars to be stimulating our appetite or not contributing to the satiety in the same way that other foods would. So that's the first way. Added sugars tend to increase our calories. They also tend to be associated with increases in weight. And we're looking at two ways for that. Maybe it's the sugars themselves, again, are stimulating our appetites, and then something different is happening with the way we're metabolizing that sugar. And in the third way, there are metabolic changes that we see in our bodies when we're consuming a lot of added sugar. So we see increases in LDL cholesterol, or the bad cholesterol, also triglycerides, blood pressure, and fasting plasma glucose. So with all of these metabolic changes, we see an increased risk for diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
And so that's really what the focus is, I think, is being concerned about those cardiovascular diseases and diabetes and those things that do have the metabolic component that you talked about. And there's only so much sugar that we can process normally, and I think if we have too much, we get the cholesterol that you're talking about. And is there also a risk of fatty liver disease that could occur in this case?
So a good bit of the research around added sugar is looking at the impact of fructose. And so if we remember back to that slide that showed the simple sugars, fructose is a component of sucrose, which is table sugar. We saw a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. Fructose, when it's consumed in large quantities, it goes to the liver and it stimulates the liver to make fats. And it also, some of that fat can be left behind in the liver and contribute to fatty liver. So that's the important thing to think about with fructose consumption. If you're consuming an apple, sure, it has fructose in it. You're going to get fructose, but you're also getting the fiber, and it's a smaller quantity than if we're drinking that can of soda or that bottle of soda versus the apple. The metabolic effects of the apple are very different than when we're consuming those sugary beverages and sugary foods.
And getting back to the fatty liver disease that we just talked about, if we have fatty liver disease or some aspect of that, can that lead to insulin resistance and therefore diabetes?
So yes, there's also research that looks at how those sugary foods affect our blood glucose control and our insulin resistance. So when we're eating a food that's really high in added sugar, we see a spike in our blood glucose. So if we think about people with diabetes and they're measuring their blood glucose, we see a response when we consume, for example, a soda. The blood glucose shoots up. Well, that stimulates the pancreas to release insulin. So the pancreas is secreting a load of insulin to respond to that glucose, and then we see that fall. So if you feel that sugar crash that comes about an hour after you eat a sugary food, that's what's happening. Also, when we experience that crash, our body thinks, well, we don't have any energy left in our bloodstream, so it starts releasing fat into the bloodstream. So we both see that response of the pancreas and the insulin, as well as the fat being released into the bloodstream that happens after we consume a large load of added sugar.
We just have about 30 seconds before we go to the break. I wanted to talk about how much is appropriate in terms of added sugar and how much is too much.
So the American Heart Association has put out a really helpful guideline for Americans. It's looking at females limiting their intake to 100 calories of added sugar per day. That's about 6 teaspoons or 24 grams if you're looking at the food label for the added sugars. 24 grams is about 100 calories. And for males, 9 teaspoons, which is about 150 calories, or if you're looking at that added sugar element on the food label, about 36 grams.
And so basically that means if you have 2 cups of coffee in the morning and you're putting 3 teaspoons of sugar in each cup, you've hit 6 teaspoons right there.
Right, so you meet the recommended limit for women.
Okay, and so if we look at the actual number of calories that people are consuming on average, what is the actual number?
We base our average number of calories Americans consume to be about 2,000 calories per day. We know there's variation within that, but if you look at food labels and guidance, those pieces of guidance are centered around a 2,000 calorie diet.
And so the amount of sugar that we're taking in on average is what, 320, 350?
Yeah, so about 15% of our calories right now, around, in the mid 300s, around 19.5 teaspoons of sugar a day is the amount Americans are typically consuming. So about 3 times what is recommended.
And from what I understand from one study, if you reach 20% of your calories from added sugar, that increases your risk of cardiovascular disease by about 38%. So that is a warning signal.
It sure is.
Okay, we have to go to the break now. When we come back from the break, we'll continue this discussion about sugar in our diet. Stay tuned.
Get involved. Become a leader in the well-being of our nation, actively lending your voice and energy to promote wellness. Be the voice for public education and health education in schools, community organizations, hospitals, and clinics. You can become part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. Virginia Gray, and we're talking about diet and sugar consumption. Now, Virginia, before we went to the break, we talked about the fact that we're eating 2 or 3 times as much added sugar as we should, and we talked about the kinds of ill effects that can have on our metabolism and in terms of increasing our risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and some other things. And so we should probably talk for just a second about what's called the Western diet. What exactly is the Western diet, and why has it become problematic?
Yeah, so the Western diet is represented by a shift that we've seen from mostly whole foods to foods that are highly processed and highly palatable, like the foods that we see here on the plates here. These foods are high in added sugar. They're easy for particularly kids to love. They're high in sugar.
Mm-hmm. And so the added sugar is the Western diet that's been adopted by much of the rest of the world now because they want to do all things American and to be in style. So you've brought in some sampling here of food. Let's start over here on the left side of, well, my left, probably the viewer's right, but you have a lot of sugar here. Tell us about it.
So these foods show us what the average consumption of sugar is in a day for children and adults. So the bowl that you see here has the 19.5 teaspoons of sugar, or around 80 grams, 320 calories of sugar that Americans are consuming each day. That applies to both adults and children. And so the foods that you see here on the plate in this bowl, we have a sugary cereal, a juice beverage, a granola bar, some fruit snacks, a crispy treat, and yogurt. These foods here contain about 80 grams or 320 calories of added sugar. And then the soda here, this one 12-ounce soda and these 6 sandwich cookies also contain about 80 grams of sugar. So if an adult consumed the soda and these 6 cookies, or a child consumed these foods here, that would provide about 80 grams or 320 calories of sugar.
And that's, again, 2 to 3 times more than what we should be consuming. You've also got an example of the sugar, the added sugar, the sucrose, or the table sugar in front. What does that represent that we're seeing in the table sugar there?
Right, so this is 19.5 teaspoons. It's the average consumption of sugar each day that we're consuming in the form of sucrose. While we're talking about sucrose, I think it's also helpful to mention high fructose corn syrup, because there's been a lot of alarm around high fructose corn syrup in the media too. And it's structurally very similar to sucrose. So high fructose corn syrup is about half glucose and half fructose. Both are contributing to our high intakes of added sugar in the American diet.
Since you just mentioned the difference between, or actually the combination of sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, which is made from cornstarch.
That's true.
There has been some concern that the high fructose corn syrup is more dangerous, if you will, to consume than the sucrose, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yes, metabolically they're very similar. The high fructose corn syrup has 2 varieties. One's 55% fructose and 45% glucose. There's actually another that's 42% fructose and 58% glucose. So you can see that 50-50 is right where that is lying for the high fructose corn syrup. Very similar to the sucrose that we see here.
And so there really isn't much difference between the high fructose corn syrup and the sucrose or the table sugar that we normally see.
That's true.
Okay, well, let's talk about healthy foods and healthy eating. You've also got that on the other side. What are we looking at there?
Okay, so I think that we hear a lot in the media people talking about all carbohydrate foods needing to be avoided, or an emphasis on low carb diets because it all turns to sugar in the body. And earlier in the show, we looked at that glucose molecule in all of the starches that we saw. But we see something different happening metabolically when we consume these foods. So here we see a salad, we see a slice of whole grain bread, some blueberries, and apples. And all of these foods together are not just giving us the starches and the sugars, they're giving us fiber, they're giving us nutrients. If you really want an added bonus, this particular bread here is a sprouted grain slice of bread. So it's even less processed than the whole grain. So if you're looking to really steady out your blood glucose, looking for things like steel cut oats or sprouted grains or wild rice or brown rice can help to improve the metabolic effects of these, even the whole grains on your health.
All right, well, let's talk about the good news about sugar consumption, because before we went to the break, we talked about the fact that it's really spiked over the years. And we have a chart that we're going to look at right now. So if we look at that chart, it gives us an example of how we've increased our sugar consumption over the years. I think it starts all the way back around 1820 or so, goes up to the present day, and you can see that graph line on the left side of the screen, which is pretty much continually going up, except that if you go to the right side of the screen, you see a spike there in that yellow region, and that spike happened about maybe 15 years ago, and since then it's been downhill on the sugar consumption. Is that the good news that we can talk about?
Sure is. The interesting thing here is, yes, first of all, that there's been a huge change in the way we're producing food, which has made sugar much more available to us as a society. Thankfully, the sounding alarm has decreased the amount of sugar that Americans are taking in, and that's really good to see that when policies are implemented, when guidelines come out, that the public actually does respond. And we've seen that for better or for worse. So 20 years ago, when the low-fat diet, the low-fat recommendations were coming out, people actually did reduce their intake of fat in response. The problem with that messaging is, first of all, there may have been a shift from sugar, emphasis on sugar in the diet, to focus solely on fat, and now we're looking at that more comprehensively. But also, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on what to replace that with. And so instead of replacing fat in the diet with whole grains and things like that, people replace it with these added sugars. And so we should have seen a shift really in fat quality from some of the unhealthier fats to a healthier fat into these types of carbs, but instead, this is where we went.
Well, let's talk about people that say, well, I just won't eat regular sugar, I'll use low-calorie sweeteners, and then I'll lose weight and I'll drink diet soda and those sorts of things. Interestingly, though, some surveys or some studies have shown that people that were on these low-calorie sweeteners didn't actually lose weight. Why would that happen?
Well, there are a couple of things to consider with that subject. One is that in studies that look at consumption of low-calorie sweeteners, we see that observational studies are used rather than putting people on a diet with added sweeteners and others not, and following them through time, which would be the gold standard for research. So we may see a reverse causality happening. People are choosing those low-calorie sweeteners because they are trying to lose weight or because they have some sort of disease state. So that has to be teased out initially. But we've also seen recently some evidence that low-calorie sweeteners may be recognized in our body a little differently than we thought before, and they may be reducing our sense of satiety or even stimulating our desire for sugar because we're consuming that sweet taste and not getting the calories associated with it.
As I had it explained to me, it's basically that we have hormonal responses in the body when we encounter sugar. Those hormonal responses say, we're going to be eating a lot of calories now because this is sugar. And so there's that desire for calories, and if you're having the low-calorie sweetener, as you say, there's no satiation from that, and so you look for other calories from other sources, other kinds of junk food to fill in what you thought you were going to get with the sugar. So you can't fool Mother Nature, I guess.
That's true. I'm just coming back from a national meeting with 11,000 nutrition professionals, and there are lots of food groups that come and food companies that are coming in and showing their products. And there were so many sparkling waters this year. So instead of the artificially sweetened beverages that we might have seen in years past, it's been a while, but now we see a lot of the sparkling waters being marketed.
Okay, well, let's talk about another population, the Native American population, which was late in joining the westernized diet, and they had a very organic lifestyle for thousands of years, and they've had a number of metabolic issues in the Native American community, including obesity and diabetes and so on. What does that tell us about diet and about the Western diet and going from a natural organic lifestyle to something that's more industrialized?
Right, so the Native Americans have seen a much more recent shift, as you said, from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, in which it was really adaptive for people to hold on to energy when they consumed it to take them through the periods when food wasn't available. They've shifted from that to the Western diet. And so there's been research looking at that population in terms of genes. There's a thrifty gene hypothesis that those genes that help people to hang on to energy, they're thrifty, help them to survive more. And we talk about this issue in my cultural foods class, both from that perspective, the scientific genetic research, but also from the perspective of cultural renewal. So we don't see that going in with a Western approach after the Western foods have elicited these responses to Native Americans to try to treat diabetes being very well received. But we've seen some types of efforts that have tried to bring back some of the older foods and allow the Native Americans to be part of the solution to dealing with diabetes in that group to be really promising.
Well, the time has just flown by and we only have about a minute left, so I want to give you a chance to give us an overview of the right way to eat without cutting out things that taste good.
So in terms of our diet, the most salient recommendations are to eat a variety of foods, a lot of plant foods. For example, what we see here, these foods with fiber can really be helpful for us. Whole grains, fruits, vegetables. Americans are only getting about 15 grams of fiber a day versus that 25 to 38 grams that is recommended. And so these fiber foods can really be helping our bodies to fight against disease. In terms of sweetness and enjoyment of sweetness, we can enjoy the sweetness, the natural sweetness that we see in fruits and in an occasional dessert.
Well, I want to thank you for being here today and sharing this important information with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.